thought is language-based. If you speak multiple languages, you can think in those different languages. Typically, the thoughts will be in the predominant native language or in the language of the speakers that is most predominant around them. So if you are native to Spanish speaking, but around mostly English speakers, sometimes that thought process will be more in English than Spanish. But if you fly home and you're around your family, the thought processes will go back to primarily Spanish. And some people can deliberately choose which languages they want to think in. But the bottom line is that thought is a language that we're talking to ourselves. And language was invented for communication purposes. We want to communicate ideas, concepts, discoveries, inventions, all kinds of things. We have good use for language, and that's okay. I often use the example of a well. If an ancient culture digs a well and they find a way to find water, they can use words and writing to communicate that to future generations. And then future generations have the opportunity to improve upon that, and then they'll communicate that. And then before you know it, you have the most advanced version of a well that you can imagine, because they're creatively building on it. And let's say that I'm coming out of a cave and there's a big bear and Gene's about to run in that cave. I want to tell him, I want to communicate with him. And there's many ways to communicate. If we have sign language, we could do sign language. I could just pretend I'm a bear. That might not be as effective if he's running into the cave. So I would probably want to talk. I would want to communicate with vibration of the vocal cords, right? And I would say, hey, Gene, there's a bear. And Gene would be like, oh, thanks. I'm not going to go in there. I'm going to run the other direction with you. Or maybe walk, because running from a bear is a bad idea. Does that make sense? The purpose of language is fundamentally for communication, right? And I've given this example somewhat recently, but if I ask Donna to think of a subject that she knows nothing about, maybe that is particle physics. She doesn't really, I have a feeling Donna knows a little bit about particle physics, but we'll just use that as an example. And I asked her, Donna, tell me everything you know about particle physics. We're going to have crickets. There's no words, there's no language around those concepts. So of course she can't communicate to me something she doesn't know. She could imagine, she could just start to make shit up, and I guess that's fine, but that's not going to help advance the science of particle physics necessarily. It can play a role, and imagination is, and we'll talk about that in a second, one of the most amazing aspects of human cognition, but I'll get there in just a moment because I'm still on thought. So thought is language-based. It's fundamentally for communication. We can learn, we can grow, we can teach, we can do all of these things with language, and that's a great thing, right? One of the principles that we discuss in this group is the principle of balance. It means that we don't necessarily go from one extreme to another, thinking that the opposite extreme is somehow better. And we'll get into that in just a moment, because that's the cause of human suffering. Instead, we find a balance. There's no reason to come to this conclusion that a human being should never think. Okay, well, why did we invent language in the first place? Like, how have we managed to create some of the amazing things that we've created? Music, when you put it on a sheet of paper, that's a language. That's a form of communication. So mathematics, arithmetic, these types of things are languages to describe something. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with these languages. A different culture, specifically in Japan, they have come up with different ways to achieve mathematics using colors and shapes rather than numbers. That's just a different language for the mathematics. And it turns out that the brain interacts with those things much better than it does numerals. Well, who knew? Apparently the Japanese, because they're doing it. All that makes sense so far? Okay. So I'll give the example of just a few other aspects of human cognition. Of course, imagination, the mind's ability to project. So we have the ability, Gene can imagine himself on a beach. That's an aspect of human cognition. I have no reason to believe necessarily that my dog is imagining himself, you know, on a dog park with a big stick. Maybe, I don't know. He dreams, so maybe he is. I don't know. But the point is that that's an aspect of human cognition, such as logic, reason, deduction, inference. These are aspects of human cognition that exist independently from thought. If you're walking down a path and you see that a tree has fallen, you don't have to think a word in your mind to recognize that your path is blocked, to recognize that you need to go under or over or around or remove the object in order to continue. You can logically reason and deduce what is occurring without words. Other animals do that. So other animals can be logical. They can, I was going to use my dog as an example, but not Neo. He's not always the most logical dog. So other people's dogs can be very deductive. They can use reasoning. One of those examples is the dog that had 300 toys, and it knew the name of every single toy. So if you said, go get Greg, it would go behind the couch and it would get the toy that is connected to Greg. But one day they put a toy that the dog was unfamiliar with. And then they said a name that the dog was unfamiliar with. And it took some time, but the dog was able to logically deduce that the toy without a name must be what the human wants through logical deduction. That was a smart dog, right? It doesn't have a language. It's not thinking in words. So these things exist independently, therefore they're not the same thing. If you can have one without the other and the other without the one, and they're not even really relying on each other per se, they are not the same thing. They're different aspects of human cognition. Music, for example. A person can sing even though they have a severe stutter. They're using different aspects of the brain. I've seen that myself. You know, my friend Chase, he grew up with a bit of a stutter. And you give him a microphone and he'll start rapping. And it's very fast and it's very fluid and it's very clear because he's interacting with a different part of the brain than language centers alone. Music is an amazing aspect of human cognition. Imagination is an amazing aspect of human cognition. Creativity, the ability to invent, to think of things that, or to imagine things that you have never imagined before. Does that make sense? Okay. Logic, reasoning, deduction, music, humor. I don't think my dog has ever laughed at any of my jokes. For whatever reason, his brain just isn't quite capable of grasping the humor that I am presenting. Then again, it might not be funny, but I'm just going to assume that my dog is incapable of grasping my humor. But dolphins, on the other hand, they love humor. They find things funny. They'll cackle. You know, you tell them a joke and they'll just start laughing at you. If you fall in the water clumsily, all the dolphins will come out and start cackling at you. They're like, you foolish human, you swim terribly. So humor, imagination, music, creativity, even our ability to access memory, which creates what we call the past. It's a cognitive thing. The future is imagination. That's a cognitive thing. It's something that we're creating in our mind. And it is all able to exist independently from word-based verbal thought in our minds. Does that all make sense so far? And now we're about to get into the gist, like the real crux of the human condition. And I don't know exactly when this happened or why this happened, but my theory is that once upon a time, humans had to really struggle to survive, to some extent or another. We hadn't invented houses the way that we have them. Even if we don't do evolution through common descent and we want to take maybe even a religious viewpoint, that's okay. We all have to agree that when we look at medieval times, you wouldn't want to go to the dentist in medieval times, right? No, you probably would be very weary of the water you're drinking back in medieval times. So we can say that there was a time in human history, the further we go back, where we had to struggle a little bit more. And according to, and I have studied Darwin enough to know that Darwin is one of the most misunderstood individuals in science. Specifically when people talk about survival of the fittest, they really have no idea what they're talking about. And it's one of those things that it just gets used wildly erroneously. But according to Darwin's theory, the more a human or any species has to struggle physically to survive, physically it will evolve if it's able to adapt and change over time. Does that make sense? So there was a time where human beings had to run faster. We had to be stronger. We even possibly had to be a little bit aggressive, right? To a certain extent. Let's say Gene is in one of those primitive cultures and he's running in that cave because he's gonna fight the bear. That's the only way for his village to survive, right? So I don't recommend that, but not in our modern environment. But once upon a time, maybe a little bit of aggression towards the bear because maybe the bear will respond to that. Remember, they say make yourself bigger. Don't run. You want to be a little bit more aggressive with that bear so that it's like, oh, well, maybe Gene's a threat. And then maybe the bear will rethink its strategy a little bit or reconsider its strategy because it's not thinking. So my theory is that the human being needed certain physical aspects to physically evolve. But once upon a time, somewhere in human history, we found ourselves at the top of the food chain. And life wasn't as difficult anymore. We found ways to hunt. We created the bow and arrow, and it's like, hey, this is easier. We learned farming techniques, gathering techniques, ways to coexist in numbers. We call that society. We created societal groups. We worked together. And then all of a sudden, Gene didn't have to go fight bears all day long because they built a fence. They built a wall. And it's like, that keeps the bears out. They stopped leaving food out all day, every day, because they realized that attracts the bears. They learned, they communicated, maybe even they talked about it. At a certain point, they had language and they could discuss these things. It went from making shapes on walls to alphabet and then to language. I did jump like 10,000 years or so probably, but yeah. So once upon a time, the human being found itself at the top of the food chain. And then all of a sudden, the mind started to evolve. And we found a flower beautiful. There's no reason physically, in terms of physical evolution, to find a flower beautiful, to find a sunset moving. So that, to me, is an indication of the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of the human mind. All of a sudden, because Gene doesn't have to hunt bears, he decided to tell a joke. He decided to create some sort of entertainment for the kids. And the mind slowly started to evolve that way. Does that make sense? But, and unfortunately, the human mind started to attach to words and verbal-based cognition in their mind. And the volume of thought started to increase and increase and increase and increase. I don't recommend it, Gene. If you were ever good at it, I don't know. And then something else happened. In modern times, We created all kinds of forms of communication. The telephone, the telegraph, and then the telephone, and then the computer, and then the internet, and then Facebook, and then the Facebook comment sections. And then, I don't know, I've never really read it, but Reddit, TikTok, all these things. And what does all of that do? It all lends to more verbal, internal thought processes. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that I really stick to what I call the principle of balance. I'm not looking to never eat cake again because cake is bad. No, but I also don't want to eat cake 3 times a day. That doesn't make sense either. I'll have a little bit of cake and I'll find the balance in that. And balance is highly subjective, but we can feel it. We know when we're in balance, especially if the verbal internal word-based cognition has relaxed enough that you can really pay attention to things. And we know when we're about to reach for that 16th slice of pizza that we're starting to get a little bit imbalanced, right? We can feel that. If not now, we'll feel it in the morning. That imbalance will have a derivative. It's called suffering. Physical suffering and psychological suffering is a result of imbalance. From that imbalance breeds 2 things, fear and attachment. And they kind of arise mutually. You know, I don't think it's advantageous which arises first, the attachment or the fear. They feed off one another. We get attached because we're afraid of something. We're afraid of something because of an imbalance. We have started to exist in an extreme. Does that make sense? And again, Buddha said that the cause of suffering was attachment, but attachment has a cause. So the root of suffering is imbalance, existing in an extreme specifically. Does that make sense? And so the human condition right now, on average, is a mind that is thinking too much. Sometimes when we feel it and we feel really crappy, we say, well, you're overthinking it. I am going to be even more literal than that. From the time that the person wakes up, from the time that a person goes to bed, most people on this earth, out of 7, didn't we hit 8 billion? I think we just hit 8 billion, so I can update my speech. We've officially hit 8 billion. I don't know how they're counting that stuff, but they think they are. So we're at 8 billion human beings. 7.9, actually, I don't know, because maybe there's some cultures out there who aren't attached to their languages. But at least 7.5 billion are waking up, launching into thought processes, and under the level of recognition, they don't even know they're doing it. They're thinking from the time that they wake up, from the time that they go to bed. And I'm not differentiating good thoughts from bad thoughts, from constructive thoughts to not. No. I don't really need to differentiate that. It is the sheer volume of thought, the sheer amount of thought that is imbalanced. Does that make sense? And that imbalance is the cause of the vast majority, if not all, of human psychological suffering. Age and things like that, accidents, that can cause physical suffering. But outside of that, our thoughts are also creating it. And what happens when someone's really imbalanced like that with thought? What happens? We get attached. We start to cling. And then we start to identify with the thinking mind as who we are. And this starts to get into, is it Toll or Tolle? Somebody yesterday said Toll. I'm like, have I been saying this man's name wrong for decades? I don't know. Toll, Eckhart. He's one of the examples that I'll use when I talk about thinking, because he really breaks it down really well. And I don't need to reinvent that wheel. He's already really explained a lot of this. So does all of that make sense? The cause of the current human condition does come from attachment. It does come from clinging, but all of that comes from imbalance, specifically the imbalance of thought being below the level of recognition, which makes the world around us below the level of conscious recognition. The present moment, the vast majority, that's why we need words like mindfulness, because the average human being is not engaging the world around above the level, above the threshold of conscious recognition. So that bubble of perception that I put up on the whiteboard, the mind is perceiving above and below the level of conscious recognition at all times. Reflexes is because your mind is able to perceive the environment below the level of conscious recognition. Once you start to see it come towards your eye and it blinks on its own and you feel the burn, now it's above the level of you recognized it now. Does that make sense? Your body requires below the level of recognition to create proprioception in the first place. Proprioception is the body's awareness of its environment in space and time. All that add up so far? So the vast majority of human psychological and physical suffering is a derivative of thinking all of the time. And I think for most of us, before we came to this group and started doing this, that would resonate, right? How many people at some point or another was lost in thought all day, pretty much every day, thinking about this, thinking about that, judging the environment in words, comparing, contrasting, trying to figure things out, recycling our opinion. You already know your opinion. Yeah, it's your opinion. Why do we have to ruminate over that again and again and again and again and again? It's an inefficient dynamic. It's not logical. And so that is basically the imbalance, the human imbalance that we're experiencing, is the mind is so engaged in thought processes below the level of recognition that most people identify with their thinking mind as who they are. And I'm not going to tell you that your thinking mind isn't a part of who you are, because it is. It's an aspect. Just like logic is an aspect of our mind, of who we are. Our physical body is an aspect of who we are, the aspects of the human that we can't see. The heart is creating that electromagnetic field. It's there. I don't know what it's worth. Not really interacting with it, but it's there. So we could logically deduce that there's other aspects to the human being that is unseen, that we can't quite see. And then further, we could deduce that there's aspects that we're completely unprivy to right now. Is that fair? Now, I'm not going to launch into what those are, because that would get a bit mystical. I can't demonstrate or explain, so I don't really go into those avenues as much. So using the mindfulness slider, we have created a process that we can learn to engage the world around us, inside of us, our breath, our sensory perception, to take the slider to above the level of recognition. And we can push that slider more and more and more away from thought that is repetitive, habitual. It's not making us feel well. It's comparing, it's contrasting, it's trying to figure things out. It's constantly judging the environment. And that's one of the biggest aspects of identifying with thought, is because now we think thought's required for everything. We've identified and attached and clinged to thought so much that we think that we have to think ourselves in and out of every situation. And that leads to a hot mess. That's the world we live in, a hot mess. with examples of inspiration and beauty. So I'm going to throw that in there. I saw Donna. So the world isn't all bad. I get that. But in general, we are creating an absolute debacle, and it's going to get worse with our ability to communicate words through the internet and through other ways. It's getting faster and faster and faster. And that's why sometimes I say that we're no longer in an information age. We're in a communication age. Because sometimes we're not even really communicating accurate information. We're just talking. And then before you know it, we have conspiracy theory on top of conspiracy theory on top of conspiracy theory. Far as I know, there's no microchip in a vaccine. And 5G isn't causing coronavirus. Far as I know. So the mind really gets weird when it's allowed to do this process completely unchecked. Does that make sense? That's a lot of information. Are there any questions so far?
Even if you take the the good and bad and the problem solving and the judging, the mind still is in a constant narration. I'm walking the beach and it's cold. It's colder than I expected. And I go, oh my God, it's cold. And I'm having a whole who the hell am I talking to? Like, I don't need all those words to experience the things that I'm experiencing. I don't need the words to navigate, closing up my jacket higher or breathing into it for my warm breath or whatever, deciding to turn back and go put on a warmer jacket. Or I don't need the words. It's just constant narration. We've become conditioned to our thoughts being our identity. You don't need them.
In fact, let's use some personal examples. So the one, Kate, who's Kate in the new Avatar? What's her last name? Winslet or something? She held her breath for 7 minutes. So she broke the record for underwater holding your breath. I think that was held by Tom Cruise for movie stars. I don't know if it's a world record for all humans, probably not, because I think there's probably an indigenous culture who's able to sit down there a little bit longer. But for movie stars, she set the record for underwater holding your breath. And she was talking about how she did it. And the bottom line is she said it's a very Zen-like state. What are they talking about with Zen-like state? Focused on your environment, focused on your body, not lost in thought. Jean likes tennis and golf. The more you think about your tennis and golf while you're doing it, you're better at it, right? No, quite the opposite. The more you're thinking about the swing, the more you'll screw up your swing. The more you're thinking about and trying to anticipate in words what your opponent is going to do in tennis, the worse you are at it. Michael is in big business in New York. I'm exaggerating a little bit, maybe, I don't know, but Michael does a lot of business in New York. And, you have meetings and you have all of these things going on, lots of stimuli. The more you think about all that, the better it is, right? The more fluid and the more you come to elegant solutions and communication, the more you think about it. No. Let's say we've lost our keys or we've lost something. The more we think about it, we're going to find our keys. Or do we find our keys the moment we stop? The moment that we stop searching, it's like, oh, my glasses are on my face. Holy cow. They weren't lost. So we've looked at this thing that we call optimal human performance, which I think is erroneous because there's no such thing as optimal. We're continuing to push the envelope of what that is. So optimal is something that is also in flux. We can continue to expand on what we would consider the optimal human experience. It almost always, though, includes a mind that is not lost in thought, but rather focusing without words on the task at hand. If you're going to tightrope walk across two buildings, I can almost assure you that thinking about it isn't going to be beneficial. If you're doing Tai Chi and you're wanting to feel the ebb and flow, that elegant ebb and flow and the energy moving in your body, comparing yourself to master yada yada in your mind isn't going to help you achieve that. If you want to be a really creative writer or a really creative scientist, thinking about it all of the time isn't going to help you arrive at that creativity. There's a lot of examples, even what's that show, Big Bang Theory. So Sheldon was trying to come up with an example. He was trying, it was uncertainty and scatter theory. But he was trying to think it out. He was trying to think it out. He was trying, and he just could not come up with the answer. So he started to work at the Cheesecake Factory. And of course, as you can imagine, he was a terrible employee. And he broke some, I think, probably plates, right? So he broke some plates and some glasses, and he looked down at the ground. And in a moment of clarity, he's like, oh, that's it. Scatter theory. Uncertainty principle. That's the answer. Einstein did visual experiments in his mind. He called them thought experiments, but if I had a conversation with Einstein, I think that we could agree that we need a differentiation between thought experiment and visual images in your mind. I hope he would agree. He was a smart guy. So he used imagery. He created space in his mind through a variety of techniques. If you read his autobiography, he had ways of clearing and creating space for imagination and creativity to come through. That's the ticket. So the more that a human being can learn to deliberately, intentionally, and willfully adjust the mindfulness slider so that they're engaging the world inside of them, the world around them, their breath, other aspects of human cognition, the more that we can emphasize that, thought starts to naturally take a back seat. And before you know it, when we do think, it's an elegant form of communication. It's a really elegant way to organize information. Thought can be great for organizing as well. And so the reason for these next 19 topics is because humanity has to have this. When Donna was in the emergency room, she saw the world differently because her mind was engaging it differently. I have seen certain things differently because my mind is engaging the world differently, and I can see trajectory. If the human being on average doesn't learn what we're doing here to some extent, no matter how it's being delivered, whether it's going off and being a monk, whether it's going off and learning to become an expert in movement, which requires relaxing the thought. If on average the human society doesn't do this, we will destroy ourselves. The human being will destroy the human being. And very likely, because we're clumsy like that, we'll destroy a lot of life in the process. We're at a point, and there's a lot of scientists who, this is old, that they look at intelligent cultures, human beings specifically, but they come up with this point that either that species will learn to cohabitate, co-create in an elegant way that's beneficial for everything, or it won't. And I think we're at that critical junction point in humanity, in human history, that if some of the things that we're talking about right now don't take root in mass, I don't believe that the human species stands a chance, at least not in the way that we view it today. I'm not a fortune teller, so I'm not going to make weird predictions or anything like that, but it will become quite difficult to survive. And we have been there before. Scientists believe that the human species was down to about 1,000 at one point, for whatever reason. Just as long as we have enough to create a significant gene pool, we can continue. No pun intended, Gene. Does that make sense? So now I'm not trying to be frightful. I'm not trying to interject fear or I'm showing the severity of the human condition and the requirement for a deliberate mind. a mind that is functioning above the level of recognition.